All right, everyone. Welcome to round 2 of the call-out debate on the topic that the amount of coverage by the liberal media on collusion with Russia is excessive and unnecessary. Sorry. So I have 2 basic premises that I want to try to push from my side of the debate. Can I just get a quick thumbs up that you can hear me okay and that everything's fine and good? Excellent. Fantastic. Okay. So the basic premise that I'm going to push here is that there have been a number of harms that have been created by the nature of the liberal media coverage around the particular part of Russiagate, and that if I can prove that those harms have been excessive, then I think that merits the fact that there should have been less coverage about the amount that has been done on that. And I'm also going to try to kind of do that through specifically the lens of what the liberal media in general should be doing, which I think looks like, firstly, acting as a media outlet, which has a responsibility to try to keep the public informed about political issues that are going on. But then there's a kind of second priority also as being part of the liberal media. They generally have a kind of progressive leftist set of ideals towards them, and that they are trying to sort of promote in their coverage of specific things, right? So the 2 basic premises of harms that I would like to sort of start with is the idea that there is the amount of time that has been spent on issues surrounding Russia have been disproportionate to the amount of severity that actually exists. I think that for the most part, the kind of harms and the degree to which the Russia collusion has been reported on is mostly based on speculation, and I think is just much less of an issue than other things that have kind of gone on during the Trump presidency. And as a second part of that, I think that there has been unacceptable opportunity cost that has been infringed upon by focusing exclusively on the Russia content, insofar as that every news story you run is running in a place of a different story that you could run. And seeing as the basic premise that of a lot of the Russia stuff has been to try to discredit the Trump administration, I think that the liberal media has been severely untactical in the way that it has chosen to focus on this as its big talking point. I think that there are a number of other things that the Trump presidency has done which are actively harmful to American citizens and the world at large, which I will talk about a little bit later. But those are the kind of 2 starting points. So I think that I'll pass it over to you for your opening comments, but as just a sort of recap of things, I think that for most of the point, the Russia stuff has been largely overblown, that I think a lot of the coverage has been based around rampant speculation, and I think that there are other more important things that the media could have been focusing on.
All right, so if I could just get a thumbs up also, if you could hear me, everything's all good? All right, sounds good. So I'm taking the negative here, and before I begin, I just want to make the observation that the way that this resolution is phrased poses it in a way that the pro has to prove 2 things: that the media coverage on the collusion with Russia is both excessive and unnecessary. And that's going to be really, really important, because even if he chooses to prove that it's excessive, but he fails in unnecessary, that's still a vote for the con. So let's get into my main points. So my first main point, I want to jump into proving that it's not excessive. So the first thing we're going to talk about is right-wing political sites often like to boast about how much time is being spent on the Russia story and how much effort is being spent by outlets like CNN and MSNBC on the Russia story. And they'll often cite studies like from the media watchdogs that say like 93% of their time is spent on the Russia story. When you actually read the study, you find that was like 1 program on like a morning thing on like Morning Joy on like MSNBC, and you find out that that's not nearly as representative as you might want to think. In the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, only 6% of the total news coverage was devoted to Russia and the campaign. This is really, really important because of the fact that 1, we're not spending a lot of time on it, right? And 2, it's people like to blow it up out of proportion, right? And I think the main way that like you can look that not that much time is, and right, the thing about excessiveness, right, is it's only excessive, right, which he talks about in his first speech, is if it's taking away from something else that's going on, right? If it's taking away from another story that the media needs to tell, right? And a really good way to tell this just isn't the truth is to go to CNN or MSNBC's websites today, where the biggest story is Hurricane Harvey, right? If you go to MSNBC's website, the first 7 stories on the website have nothing to even do with Trump, right? And if you go to CNN's website, you can't find a story about the Trump-Russia collusion on the first page at all. I think this is really, really important because of the fact that it's only excessive if it's taking away from something else, right? And then, right, the other burden, the way that this sort of gets painted in a negative light, right, is that this is a month by month, very long thing that goes on, right? Of course, there's going to be a lot of media attention dedicated to it, right? Like, obviously, we have things coming up the entire time. That's why it's a big deal. That's why you can talk about it in slow news days, right? I don't think that's necessarily bad, A, because it's not taking away from anything else, and B, just because that's the inherent nature of it, right? And then he talks a little bit about this idea of, well, it's just all speculation, right? That's kind of the job of the news, right? They report on things that can be speculative, that could tend towards a conclusion that might implicate him. And that's what the role of the investigation is in itself, to implicate him. I'm not saying that the news has to somehow like warrant an implication of Trump with Russian collusion.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, so to deal with the majority of what your argument is there in terms of that having to prove that it's excessive, I don't think that it's necessarily fair for you to claim that just because that there are other news stories that they're running in regards to sort of like Hurricane Harvey and all these sort of things like that, that counts as that it is entirely being taken away, right? Because obviously the news hasn't been reporting, entirely on this Russia thing. And also I will admit that obviously I'm an Australian, so I don't have the kind of on the ground sort of gauging of what the kind of runtime experience of these various programs are. So I will defer a little bit to your expertise in that particular regard. The thing that I would like to say is that I think that what is a more reasonable sort of burden to kind of look at in this debate is about whether or not the amount of coverage that has been devoted to this story is proportionate in regards to the the likelihood of the impacts, the degree of information that we have, and the sort of, and specifically considering that it's about like news and media coverage, the amount of sort of new information that comes to light and new developments. The main push that I'll make into say that it has been excessive in regards to that speculation is that I think a lot of that speculation often has been, from what I have seen, quite ungrounded and quite not sort of, more kind of like talking points than actually kind of analyzing or breaking down any like new facts or new evidence that has come to light. So for example, there was a couple of months ago where I think where certain hosts like Rachel Maddow had this whole sort of story where it was like, Trump appears to be getting friendly with Russia, and she basically implied that they might have like some tape of some, like that they were kind of blackmailing him or something. That's the kind of thing which I think would count as being excessive, because there's no new information that's being passed out. There's no new pieces of data that's being analyzed. It's merely sort of going on conjecture and the kind of like, hearsay evidence from things that various other people have said. And I think that going back to my point about that it's the role of the media to try to keep the public informed, I think there's something that's actively damaging about trying to just continually report and continually regurgitate sort of hearsay and conjecture, as opposed to reporting on sort of like actual pieces of analysis that have come out. And the other thing that I would like to point out, in to the degree to which it's excessive, is that from what I've heard from various sources, that there is a kind of culture that if people kind of, like I think Glenn Greenwald and other people have sort of questioned the validity of this, the continued speculation on Russia, and as such have been called sort of unpatriotic and kind of been accused of trying to side with the Kremlin on this. I think that's a very dangerous precedent for media outlets to set, where there can't be a culture of critical analysis of the facts without being accused of being unpatriotic on side. Like there's elements of that are kind of straight up Orwellian. So I think that based on the proportion to which it is severe, does not merit the amount of reporting that it has in fact gotten.
Yeah, and I totally agree with your last statement there. That if somebody speaks out in kind of speculation against the collusion with Russia, they're sort of seen as an naysayer. I agree, that's completely wrong, but that has nothing to do with the point, right? The point is whether the coverage giving it to them by the liberal media is excessive and unnecessary. So first, let's just touch on what we're talking about here, right? If the Trump campaign made an attempt to collude with Russia, this would be the single largest crime in the history of America, possibly the history of the world. Our government would be illegitimate. Not only do we already know that the Russian government tried to interference and did interfere in the US election, right? If the Trump campaign actively tried to promote that to give themselves a competitive advantage, this would be huge, right? So right there, it shows you that it's at least necessary, even if they're dedicating too much time and speculation to it, right? This would be huge. And as he states, and as I 100% agree, the first job of the media should always be to inform the public. That's an obligation they have. informing the public on things that might be the greatest crime in the history of the world, I would say is definitely necessary. But then let's go on to what he talks about this entire idea of like proportionality, of like what you're, like, are we talking enough about the things that actually matter? Because he talks about how like, oh, on Rachel Maddow, she says, well, there might be something like this a lot. There might be something like that a lot, right? What we have to understand is, once again, under his own interpretation of what the idea of what the news media is, the purpose of what the news media is, right? We should be spending a lot of time on this. Even if Rachel Maddow maybe not have a good idea some of the time, and sometimes we just sort of give our half-assed theories about what's going on, right? We still have experts on that, the woman who helped persecute the Watergate trial, and what this, back when the Donald Jr. emails got leaked about the meeting in Trump Tower with Manafort and Kushner and all that, right? Her talking about what this could be, how this could be similar, what we should expect this to play a part in Mueller's investigation, right? I don't see how these are necessarily bad things, right? Even if you are spending a slower news day speculating and then maybe saying something that's not entirely true, right? Like, those things don't definitely in no way outweigh all the information that we're going to be getting, because this story is just so huge, right? I mean, just think of all the things that have come out, right? You have the Donald Jr. emails linking, you have Flynn, Comey getting fired, you have Manafort, you have all these things. Even today, right, and which is why I brought up Hurricane Harvey, right? Today, the Kremlin literally announced that Trump's lawyer reached out to the Kremlin to try to initiate the deal for Trump Tower, which doesn't imply collusion, but it definitely implies that Trump could be involved in some sort of money laundering with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but some sort of violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right, which would still be a very huge deal and definitely fall under Mueller's investigation, right? But we don't see that on these news websites today. It's not taking away from anything. And the reason that I brought that up in the first case is because one of your points was that there's this negative turnoff that this other news gets pushed aside, and that's just simply not.
Okay, cool, fair enough. So I just want to deal with the basic crux of you're saying that this is the single greatest crime that has existed. I think that is something that is just not true, specifically in the context of the Trump administration and at large. So this is the push of where I think that most of the Russia coverage has been kind of overblown in regards to its severity. So as far as I kind of break it down, I think that there have been like kind of two main prongs of the Russia speculation. The first has been regarded with the like email leaks that were leaked during the presidential campaign of like Hillary. And the second being the kind of like various meetings that have occurred. You talked about like Trump Jr. and Kushner and stuff, kind of reaching out to these things. So just specifically to deal with the emails. I don't know if you saw this, but I'll post in a link in the thing below, that there was actually a report that was released by the intelligence, I think, proficiency. There's an organization called VIP, which is basically a bunch of like ex-NSA and ex-CIA people who started during like the Bush administration to try to disprove that there were Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and had since they draw from that.
All right, so kind of unfortunate. I can't really, you lagged out 100%, like kind of really early on into that. So I didn't really get anything other than you starting to explain what other, why this is not one of the greatest crimes in the history of the world. And you were bringing up something, but I didn't really catch it there. So kind of unfortunate that happened. I don't know, maybe your problems will be fixed in a second when you come back on, but I'm just gonna do my best, try to be charitable, and I'm just gonna try to respond and strengthen that argument as best I can. Oh, I see your video now. So hopefully you'll be back on your next speaking turn. So the reason I think that this would definitely be one of the biggest, if not the biggest crime in the history of the world is just because of the legitimacy of elections, right? And the way that our government has to work, at least in the United States, right? The way it has to work is there has to be some sort of legitimacy. Without legitimacy, the government loses any sort of obligation, or the people lose sort of any obligation to follow what the government says, right? If this is not a government that has been, democratically elected by the people in a fair election, that is a huge deal. There would be legal ramifications that I can't even get into. That would be such a huge deal. So for somebody to say, well, it's kind of unnecessary for the liberal media. The amount of liberal media coverage is kind of unnecessary because, Rachel Maddow comes on sometimes and, sometimes she speculates stuff that's like not entirely 100% based in fact. Like the fact that could like be like an argument that like the amount of coverage on this is like unnecessary is kind of absurd to me, right? Even if there wasn't a direct invite, right, from the Trump campaign to, I don't know, to have Russians, interfere in our elections, which I would say at this point is still highly likely that could have happened, right? There's still the chances that there could have been something that Donald Trump did that was highly illegal. There's so many opportunities Donald Trump could have had with all of his real estate dealings to launder money through the Russians. He definitely has so many connections with Russian oligarchs, right? All of these things starting to add up. It just seems a little too fishy for somebody to say, oh, well, the liberal media is sort of overblowing all this, right? And like I said before, the liberal media, it's not their job to implicate Trump in some sort of crime, right? The liberal media, or the media in general, because I do agree that the media, one of the responsibilities, the first of which to be a fact, in fact, as a matter of fact, the League of Journalists for Human Rights states that the first responsibility of a journalist is to state the facts, and one of the other obligations of a journalist is to provide a fair viewpoint. So I 100% agree on this. But the problem is the opposite of a fair viewpoint doesn't mean, well, you're overblowing that, right? It's trying to show the other side that maybe this isn't, right? And nobody's trying to do that. The only other side of this conversation is the liberal media is, they're blowing things out of proportion, not, oh, well, maybe that, we're not explaining the evidence that the liberal media is saying, oh, well, this is very circumstantial. Maybe we should be smelling something fishy. They're just saying, no, it's, blowing it out of proportion. Don't be.
Yeah. So I think on regards to that from my sort of looking into this, I just don't think that there's enough evidence that it has been supplied that Russia did anything substantial enough to delegitimize the election. So as I already kind of talked about before, the main thing that people were pointing to were like the leaks of Hillary Clinton's emails during the election season that caused like a vast favorability sway. There's heavy amounts of evidence that was a inside DNC link and not in fact Russian tampering. See, I think you disagree with this at the moment because this is the narrative that's been pushed by the media that this is the thing. But I will post the source afterwards. That senior ex-NSA analysts have sort of concluded that there is no way that could have been a Russian election. The only other source that I saw is like there was an idea that Russia directly hacked voting machines, but again, that has been unsubstantiated by any kind of evidence. The NSA say they have evidence, but if they had it, surely they would produce that to the public. Their failure to do so is inadequate to prove that there has been any kind of substantial election hacking. In regards to your things about like him trying to illegally launder money, yeah, I agree. Like conflicts of interest is a huge deal and is something that should probably be grounds for the thing where they get rid of the president. I forget what the word is for it. I'm very tired at the moment. But the thing is that you don't actually need to focus on Russia to be able to do that. He's already had proven financial ties to places of Saudi Arabia, which we then left off the travel ban. There was the huge contract thing that went through in China where he tried to get some sort of trademark and then the government blocked him and then he became president and passed something that was favorable to China and then suddenly he got the trademark. But I didn't hear about that through any of the usual sources like HuffPo or Vox or anything like that. I heard about that on Cracked, which is like a comedy website. And I think when you're getting that, when that kind of commentary isn't coming from reputable sources and is coming instead from a place that makes videos about how Homer Simpson is actually the Buddha, I think that speaks severely detrimentally to the kind of quality that you're getting within the election coverage, right? So this is why I think the main harm of the liberal media is because I think that they have pushed this idea that Russia was a huge threat to the illegitimacy of the election. So also just going back to the Hillary impact claim, right? The other thing about that is that like leaking of that information doesn't necessarily undermine the legitimacy of the election, because if it's the extent that it's stuff that was going on that was kind of shady that people like rightly should have known about in the first place, then that information becoming public does not in itself delegitimize the election. There's probably a good case to be made that that information should have been just been made public anyway, right? So I think that the burden of proof that needs to be met here is the idea that there has been some evidence that or reasonable kind of doubt that Russia did play a large role in determining the outcome of the election. And what I have seen from my research is that simply that evidence does not exist. And I think the fact that the media has pushed this idea and pushed this narrative that evidence does in fact exist is evidence of the fact that has been a problematic coverage, because it means that they have, you know, on the criteria that we have both agreed of, they have misled the public as to the nature of this election.
Okay. I find it really, really funny that so many people are willing to completely write off the CIA, NSA, the FBI coming together to write a joint letter, which is then signed by 14 other intelligence agencies in the US. I'm unaware of a time that's ever happened in US history. If someone else could point that out to me, where that's ever happened, and then been wrong, part of some greater conspiracy to mislead the public, I'd really love to see that information that's outweighed by like a couple CIA analysts who say that there may be something fishy, which I'd love to see after this. But if somebody could really, really explain to me how this would ever happen in the past and how it would be a grand conspiracy to mislead the public, that just to screw over Donald Trump, I'd really love to see that. Let's talk on a couple other things. You say, well, first, of course, you say that I haven't seen the evidence. There's obviously national security reasons for that, because if we tell them what evidence we have, they will be able to adapt in the future. This happens literally all the time. So people, I don't understand why these quote unquote skeptics are they're so skeptical about that, but not about the fact that there might have been collusion in the election, right? And then there's this thing that it might have been from inside the DNC. There's little to no evidence about that. And if he's citing the Seth Rich thing, I would really, really, really love for him to take a look at all the people who pulled that story, because it was just so ridiculous, right? And then he goes on to say, well, even if that's not true, it should have been public in the first place. And maybe that's true. Maybe that information getting out to the public would have turned out to a more representative election. But the fact that a foreign country, one that we are in no way friendly with, tried to expose that to get the candidate that would be soft on them into office is ridiculous to even imply that should have been the way it went down. Maybe it should have been leaked from within the DNC. There's no evidence that happened. Maybe, it should have been out there in the first place. That probably would have been a good thing, right? But the fact that a foreign government is doing it completely legitimizes the entire democratic process. It completely legitimizes the entire election process. And this is really, really important. And then he says, oh, well, then about the business dealings and how there definitely is something really shady going on there, right? And he's like, well, why don't we see them talking about this with his business dealings with Saudi Arabia, with all these other countries? And you do, for sure. When the Muslim ban came out, the fact that Saudi Arabia wasn't on the list of them, or the travel ban, if you want to call it that, the fact that Saudi Arabia was on there raised a lot of questions. And there were a lot of people reporting that. But no, he just seems to overlook that when it comes to Russia, right? And this is still really important, even if this doesn't have anything to do with the campaign or the election, because if our president has been laundering money for Russian oligarchs, he definitely isn't fit to be president. And I think that is some information that definitely should have been out before the election, and not this entire thing about how, oh, well, maybe this information about Hillary's emails and the Podesta email should have been out before the election. I think that's definitely something that should have been out before the election, if you want to go down that road. So once again, right, we're seeing that this coverage, one, does not take away from other things that are going on in the news, so it's not excessive, and certainly is going to be necessary, because it is definitely a very big deal that has a very, very high probability of it.
Okay, cool. Just to deal with some of those points for a second, like you're saying that the CIA and the NSA had come out with this report that was backed up by 14 agencies. You know what came out a month after that whole report? That one of those 14 agencies was the Coast Guard, right? Like that was a massive fabrication that was pushed by the Democratic Party to try to like legitimize this sort of thing. All right, yeah, I see the thing, but like seriously, go look it up. Like it's, and you're saying that's like, oh, what precedent do we have for not trusting the CIA and the NSA? I don't know, man. Like, what about the whole Snowden thing? Like, you remember when there was there's been a long history of these intelligence agencies trying to deceive the American people and try to cover up their own situations and their own like agendas within this context. I don't think that it's entirely unreasonable for them to be doubting that. And I think that a big harm that has come out of this coverage, right, is that instead of questioning the legitimacy of those agencies in the first place, so that when the media says that, oh, we have this story that the NSA has said that, they say, yeah, well, remember that time a couple of years ago when the NSA claimed this and that later turned out to be false? Remember ages ago where, like, you know, during the Bush administration, where the CIA claimed to not be, you know, providing these torture networks, and they came out that those torture networks were in fact in place? I think those are the kinds of questions that should be asked by the media, because it is equally their role to hold other kinds of powerful institutions accountable as much, if not more, than politicians individually, right? So the idea that there has not been adequate evidence to prove that those email leaks did come from Russia, and I will post the source underneath, that from senior analysts to say that it was unlikely that it did, and that it was most likely a leak from inside the DSE email. And I think that seeing that the only evidence that we have to go on comes from something that is unsubstantiated. Oh, that was the other thing that you said, right? You're just like, well, we can't let them know how we found out, because otherwise they won't do it again in the future. Like, if this stuff is true, they already know that the methods that they used got found out, so they're already not going to use those methods going forward in the future. So there's no reason why they wouldn't be able to come out and say, this is how we found out how we did it, right? If they need to provide the legitimacy of that to be actual, take like the legal action and discredit that, then surely they would just come out with it in the first place, right? Just doesn't make any sense. The last thing you want to talk about is like, oh, we shouldn't, you know, we should focus on all this oligarchic stuff. See, this is the problem, and I think this is the big harm about why it's delegitimized, is about why it's been excessive, right? Is because, like, for everyone who thinks that Russia isn't a big deal, the amount of time that the media has spent talking about this has totally delegitimized them, right? So when they do come out and talk about Saudi Arabia and say, oh, the president has broken the emoluments clause and done something unconstitutional for which he should be impeached, right? They said, oh, you were just saying that the other day when you had just speculation from like unverified NSA sources about this collusion with Russia, right? There needs to be a limit to how much the you know, media can push a narrative of this is a thing that happens before they just become the media outlet that cried wolf. You need to be like selective with the amount of time that you make large claims like this is something that breaks the law, this is something that is unconstitutional, this is something for which the president should be impeached. Because if you do that without the adequate evidence to back those claims up, then you make up yourself looking foolish, and it's something that delegitimizes your platform going forward. And I'll pass the mic back to you for the
Right. A few really big things here. Classified does not equal unverified. This is huge. The notion that we wouldn't release information because the Russians may have been hacking us or doing things, trying to influence our election in other ways. If they found out that all the ways that we knew they were doing it, they can now pour all their energy into those other ways. That's why it happens, right? The other problem with this narrative is that it's unfalsifiable, which is not a good thing, right? I can bring up all the agencies that talk about it. And by the way, I know the Coast Guard was one of those agencies. I said 3 wrote the letter, the rest verified through letter. I'm not saying the Coast Guard has this information, right? I can point to all these agencies that will verify this information. But he can always just say, well, they may be lying, right? So don't talk about it. They may be lying, right? Here's the problem, right? Any evidence that we have can't be verified now. We have no evidence to go off of anything. So it doesn't matter if anybody did commit a crime, right? I just, once again, find it really funny that there's all these skeptics that are so skeptical about all the evidence that comes forth, but they're not skeptical on the other side whatsoever. And they give zero, you know, a thought to the other side that they might be wrong, right? That's the problem with this narrative. You know, like, and, you know, further, right? He doesn't show the harms from this, right? He's just saying, well, there's these news networks that are the news networks that cried wolf, right? He doesn't tell you a single time that the news networks have spread misinformation. And even if he could, right, he can't tell you one time that they've spread misinformation and then didn't recall it, right? Inherently spread misinformation with a bad intention of misinforming the public, right? He can never tell you that because it simply doesn't happen, right? They only report things that they've gotten sourced, right? Even if they can't report those sources for reasons that the source will dry up after that, right? So and he can't point you to anything that he can prove has been wrong either. So if he's being so skeptical, he can't even apply that logic to his own side, right? He's pretty much dropped the argument, right, about how this is a huge deal that just delegitimizes the entire democratic process. Don't let him bring it up again, right? Because it just simply goes unresponded to, right? If this is true, right, either we have a president who has, you know, committed, you know, high felonies with foreign oligarchs, or we have somebody who's worked to delegitimize the entire democratic process by undermining the election process, right? And both of which are completely necessary. So he loses on the necessary part of the resolution. But then on the excessive part of the resolution, he also completely drops his argument, right, about how this is going to take away, there's going to be, a harmful trade-off because this takes away from other news sources. And, the evidence for that even comes from today, right, when one of the biggest, breaks in this investigation that the Kremlin, they confirmed that there has been, there was Trump's lawyer reached out to them. That doesn't even make the front page. The He was unnecessary and
Yeah, fair enough. All right, I have 20 seconds to make closing remarks. So I think the thrust of what I was making is that the amount of time they spent talking about it in regards to how big a story it is disproportionate, and that is what constitutes the excessiveness. I had other ways in which the opportunity cost was going to manifest, but we ran out of time to talk about those things. I will post the evidence to which I think about why these claims have been unsubstantiated, and I would encourage people to look at that before they're voting. Thank you very much for the debate. I think it was high quality.